Hello, my name is Kai, and this is the second to last video I have on Andoni Iraola's tactics, this time talking about midfield dynamics. But before I get into it, it'd be great if you could like the video, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Twitter and Substack at The Counterpress. So like all of my tactics videos, we are on the board talking about the ideas. So Andoni's midfield is best understood not as like some rigid positional framework of some kind, but instead it's a way of controlling and curtailing what is normally seen as chaotic Bielsa-like football. What this means is that his teams are always going to create disorder. You're creating disorder through the pressing, you're creating disorder because of the transitional moments. You are always creating this insane level of chaos, right? And in this chaos, there needs to be some level of stability. I've talked about control before with retaining the ball and that sort of thing. But your midfield is the heart and engine room of your team. It's where a lot of the control happens. So the dynamics of an Andoni Iraola midfield are very, very crucial. For the most part, if you look at the profile of an Andoni Iraola midfielder, they're pretty mobile. They're able to move around, cover a lot of space. Some of them usually are able to shield the defense. A lot of them are able to go forward and score goals on their own, like an Alex Scott. Of course, some shield, like a Tyler Adams. You can see that he has midfielders or different players that fill into positions that get vacated during presses. It's very clear that the midfield is once again the heart of the team. If we talk about his variants or the different concepts he had, at IK, I believe it's Larnasa, he used to play with a 4-1-4-1 style press, typically, which meant that your two midfielders would often be like players who are high eights, right? And in that way, I've already talked about the pressing dynamics here, but here you have a clear midfield three, right? With one single pivot. The single pivot really isn't in vogue nowadays. There aren't many players who could play as a single pivot and shield the defense like your Fernandinhos, your Fabinhos, your Rodris. There aren't many, so it's pretty common to see this kind of get phased out now for more of a double pivot, which is what Iraola is sort of known for, is different types of double pivots here and there. Initially at Mirandes and at Rayo, he didn't vertically stack his double pivot. In fact, at Rayo Vallecano, we saw that he actually went for a box midfield at times for progression, because that's what he felt would offer the best stability in his team. A box midfield allows the wingers to go wide. At least one of them can go wide or go central. It allows the fullbacks, the attacking wingbacks, to go up and down the pitch as much as they possibly want to. It creates a very stable defensive structure that lends itself to a lot of overloads. Normally you're going against three-man midfields, so if you have a four-man midfield, you could easily play around that three-man midfield. Of course, you usually sacrifice some level of threat in behind, but there are ultimately trade-offs in anything that you do in football. And having a box midfield helps you stabilize a lot of the chaos, but also lends itself as a pretty good pressing structure and gives you a pretty clear rest defense as well. I would say the recognizably Iraola system was back in the day having overlapping fullbacks, inward moving wide players. You would often see, his 10 going inward as well, but his wingers both going inward, tucking inside sometimes to create this structure. Really aggressive overlapping wingbacks to occupy and constantly provide threat in behind, with easy passes that could be found into these players who are on the wing. Could directly bypass the midfield and go from defense into attack here, find combinations out wide, that sort of thing. I've talked about Iraola's wide play in depth, right? But this is the evolution of his team. I think the main thing that we want to focus on is how he played at Bournemouth, because it's the nearest evolution of what Andoni Iraola's tactics look like. And I think the main thing that is interesting for me here is how he treats these three players, his number 10 and his two 6'8s. Typically, there's one player who looks to receive directly, and another player who goes further forward for direct progression. A lot of people see this as like a 6 or an 8, or this is maybe the hallmarks of a midfield 3, but in reality, this is what I call a vertically stacked double pivot. The reason you do this is, if you put your fullbacks really far wide, like he usually does, and you split your center backs, you create a big hole. So one of them has to be one of these players dropping in, it could be either, while the other goes forward for immediate progression. Usually, they kind of take a position that's a bit askew, and the reason for that is the other player, the number 10, operates more like a second striker. And the reason for this is you create a clear line of build-up that's staggered, so that you can get the ball from the 6, who's playing in that, 6 position in this case, the 6-8 in the 6 position, to the 6-8 in more of an 8 position, to the second striker 10, to the striker. But you also have the opportunity of passing directly into a winger, right? Whichever one is open, or into the fullback that's open. You also could mirror this completely and go into the other winger who can drop in and give it to the 10, or then find the midfielder in space, and suddenly you're on your way and you're attacking. It creates a sense of verticality. This is somewhat different from like a vertical tiki-taka, which is what a lot of people talk about in terms of vertical controlled progression now, like in Enzo Maresca. This is much more Bielsa-like, because it creates a lot of chaos, right? The moment one player goes in the midfield, someone else is going to run alongside them. The midfield structure is constantly going to get disrupted. It's why a lone 6 doesn't really fit the Iraola mold. Iraola isn't looking for the lone 6. He's looking for 2 6-8 hybrids who can get up and down the pitch, who are both capable of receiving, who are both capable of carrying, but he normally does have one midfielder who tends to be more physical, like a Tyler Adams, and one who tends to be a bit more mobile and attack-minded, like an Alex Scott. You would think maybe a good fit here would be like a Manu Kone and a Dominic Szoboszlai, but I'm not really here to talk in terms of those types of tactics. I'm just saying what he could do now. Sure, this is maybe more conducive of this. Ryan able to carry further forward. Dom could maybe receive and ping the ball long if he needed to. Of course, neither player is the ideal 6. Both players are 8s who can vaguely play as a 6. They're barely even 6-8 hybrids, but I digress. This is the situation that we have, and these are the tactics that Iraola uses. But his pivot doesn't just do this, right? It also is at times side by side. This gives you 2 options, 2 players who can drop in. It allows you to shift to one side, commit one player here while the other goes high. It allows the goalkeeper to pick either one of these players. You pass into this direction, you meet this guy, who then immediately tries to play it forward. So a lot of the times you see it start as an actual double pivot, and wherever the ball is played, to whichever defender or to whichever midfielder directly, determines who goes further forward. This is also why people tend to call this a midfield 3, because you see a lot of this happening. But even then, I'm telling you that this isn't a midfield 3. There's a clear double pivot here based on the roles they have. Maybe not the space they're currently occupying, but it's still a double pivot. It's why when James McConnell went so far forward, at times beyond the 10 in the Monaco game, he was still in the double pivot. This is the intentional thing that Iraola is doing with this pivot. When they go into their deep rest defense, right, when they're all the way in their own half, you can see that they stand next to each other. Sure, one of the wingers usually goes low while the other goes high, but you can still see a clear side-by-side double pivot. And you can see a similar variation when we're actually pressing, right? Because we also see this vertically stacked double pivot here. One of them goes further forward into what Harrison from the overlap breakdown would call a 4-4-2 diamond press. I call it a 4-1-3-2 as a result of this line being much flatter than I think is suggested, because a diamond makes you think it looks like this, when in reality it's really anything like this. It's just a vague 3, with one player in behind, who has the role of winning the second ball. If they go long here, Van Dijk, Jake, whoever can head it over to you. We've of course also seen Iraola have an auxiliary midfielder at times where this will happen. The reason you do this is because it's even easier to win second balls, but you lose a bit of coverage in terms of threat in behind. But in general is pretty good at retaining the ball and winning the ball from the, after it's been headed by the backline. So I understand why he does it, but it's very situational. For the most part, he's looking at this 4-1-3-2 press. So again, you see this vertically stacked double pivot. We also at times see him do this mid block, high block, where you get a classic 4-4-2. Again, you have the double pivot stacked normally here, and you press this way instead. The benefit of this is it's much harder to play through and forces the ball long. In this case, one of the center backs usually pushes up to fill this position while the others shuffle over. And this is also very conducive to a counterattack, because if you head it, Van Dijk gets it and plays it to the midfield, you already have 4 players who can attack and run in behind. So a lot of the midfield dynamics also involve which midfielders go in and out of it, which players join into the midfield, whether it's Frimpong or a center back, to help maintain stability or win a second ball, whether the number 10 is able to drop in, whether the wingers come in to pack the midfield space. These are all part of the dynamics of an Andoni Iraola midfield. And the reason I'm explaining this is because I keep getting a lot of questions about what a vertically stacked double pivot is. But a double pivot is all about roles, what you're doing, the types of players there. They're both expected to be the first receiver, which tells me that they're both part of a pivot, because Florian Wirtz isn't expected to be the pivot. At times, you see them play directly in because the pivot also vacates too. Sometimes we can get vacating players, which drags maybe their markers out wide, which allows direct play from a center back into the striker or into the number 10. The midfield has a massive role in causing progression. People talked about before how Arne Slot really focused on his midfield as the heart of the team in terms of progression. And this is true, but I think Andoni Iraola relies on his midfield as the heart of literally everything. Of the attack, of the press, of the build-up. The midfield is everywhere. No one has a more complicated role than the midfield. The wingers, they either go in behind, they come narrow, they go wide. The role is pretty simple. The fullbacks, they either underlap, overlap, they go in behind, short passes, go wide in initial build-up, easy. The center backs, you look to play it to whoever's open. If nobody's open, you kick it long. The 10 and the striker have a good close relationship. The 10 sometimes drops a little bit deeper, can sometimes go a bit more wide, has freedom to fill space. The striker just needs to maintain himself centrally to get shots off, go into space in the channels or the half spaces if the ball ends up falling there in a direct attack. Really simple. Meanwhile, the midfield, you have to think about who's going to receive. When he receives, I have to react. When I react, I have to find the next pass quickly. I have to move the ball quickly. I can't linger. I have to trust my own ability. Out of possession, somebody has to go forward and be a major part in blocking the central progression, the most dangerous part. The other guy has to defend zone 13, has to win the second ball, check his shoulder, also has to shield the defense if the press is bypassed. The other midfielder has to be one of the first to run back. Of course, one of the other wingers is probably helping you with one high, one low, but you are constantly checking your shoulder. You have to maintain a short amount of space between the backline and yourself, because if you don't, they're going to bypass you and it's your fault because you weren't there. And you both can't be the only ones intercepting because you leave this space and force someone to commit, which can cause fouls. It's one of the reasons why Verge conceded a pen against Monaco. So you have to make sure one of you is further back, which means you have to cover even more distance. The midfield is really hard to play in an Andoni Iraola system. It's why I give Alex Scott high praise, because it's very, very difficult. Look, at IK, he had much more of a lone number 6, right? Which was a difficult position to find now. Mirandes, he evolved. Rayo Vallecano, he used the box midfield to create stability. I think it's definitely something that we could attempt. It's one of the reasons why I used to suggest this idea of Dom right wing, because my idea was, if you have Florian Wirtz here, and you have Dominic Szoboszlai here, maybe you replace Rio Ngamoa with somebody like Bradley Barcola. You have threatened behind fullbacks, you have clear progression structures that you can create to get the ball up the pitch and into the striker. There's good stability, but I think the issue in the Prem is, without having two orthodox wingers on both sides in the modern Prem, it's really difficult to beat these really defensive low block style systems. And although you get the stability and the possession and good out of possession structures from a box midfield, it's just not that realistic in the modern Prem to do that. I think you would need to have a really, really athletic box midfield, which we sadly do not have. So I think that's why you probably won't even consider something like that. That's why I think he moved away from it with Bournemouth. Of course, you see a lot of rotations in midfield as well. Dom is going to have a strong in-possession role on top of an out-of-possession role. So will Grav at times. They're going to be expected to go forward. They're going to be expected to join as part of this front five. Either of them, whoever is further forward. Sometimes they'll have to come more central, and you have to make sure that you know where your fullbacks are to make sure that there's still defensive stability, that you're marking these guys who might be able to run in behind. So the midfield has a massive role. They're the people who have to think the most. They have the fewest automations. They have some in terms of very specific build-up structures, but it's difficult. And you have to pass and move, right? In the early phase of build-up, you have to be able to pass and move like Alex Scott does. If you're picking up the ball like Ryan Gravenberch here, and you immediately pass it forward into somebody like Dominic Szoboszlai, you can't just then stick around. You have to allow yourself to go further forward and continue the progression. And then you have to make the decision. Are you going to commit forward and vacate the space and trust the people behind you? Or are you going to stick here and hope that Florian Wirtz can get it to the winger and you get enough combinations here? And then are you the guy who keeps going forward, or does the other guy? Really good understanding needs to happen in this midfield for it to work. And we're definitely going to see ourselves get played through, not just because it's a pressing system, and that's what always happens in a pressing system, but because the midfield role is really difficult. I use the words 6 and 8 to represent a vague profile that I want, but you don't really need a lone 6 or a lone 8. These profiles are very fluid. We just need to aggregate a bunch of traits in this midfield across the two players. We need people who can progress the ball forward, either through deep progressions, line-breaking passes. We need progressive carries that lead to progressive passes. We need people who can shield the defense, people who can press, people who can cover ground, people who can operate inside the block, out wide when they're outside the block, or drop in between the center backs, who are capable of being both the first and second receiver, who are press resistant. It's very, very difficult. That's why I think we can't neglect the midfield role under Andoni Iraola. A typical progression framework in Bournemouth was the center back or the 6 gets a forward vertical pass to the 9 or to the number 10, and then the other one attacks the second action. The winger could attack the second action. 8 then overlaps, a fullback overlaps. You get ball progression out wide. You get a cutback or a cross into 1 or 2 players, maybe 3 who have attacked the box, like the 8, the striker, and the 10, and you end up with some kind of goal, right? A lot of that is just dependent on how the midfield operates. Pressing triggers usually aren't determined by the midfield, but the secondary pressing triggers usually are, the midfield and the fullbacks. Obviously, the best tactical fit with our current midfield is Dom, followed by Wirtz. We, of course, would need to sign a 6. Ryan's probably not ideal. Even Trey, he has some more of the traits that you would want in possession, but out of possession, he might be worse than Grab in some aspects, which is definitely an issue. So I wonder what we're going to end up doing this season. There are a couple of different things that I've thought about. I've thought about the possibility of, at times for Rayo Vallecano, both wingers would tuck inside. I've thought about long-term, or at least in certain games, having Hugo Ekitike and Alexander Isak play as the 9 and the 10, with maybe like Trey Andoni and Ryan Gravenberch. Both of these players are able to tuck in, and you create this sort of progression. Some people might think this is insane, but I think the benefit here is you get some pretty clear progression. You get 3 players who could get goals, plus a really good presser up front. You get threatened behind fullbacks. Decent enough pivot between these two with a pass first player and a carry first player. Maybe concerns out of possession. Maybe Dom helps with that, with solid center backs who can both cover wide areas while also not leaving a massive gap centrally. But these are just ideas at this point. But I hope this video helped you a bit in understanding the midfield dynamics of Andoni Iraola. If you liked the video, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Twitter and Substack at The Counterpress. And as always, thanks for watching.